I'm joined today by Temple Northup, assistant professor in the Jack Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston. He studies the impact of the media on our attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, and actually has a very interesting study titled Effects of Long-Term Exposure to News Stereotypes on Implicit and Explicit Attitudes, which was recently published in the International Journal of Communication. It's so great to have you on. You know, we talk so much about where people's beliefs come from, particularly when we talk about discriminatory or racist or homophobic beliefs. And certainly we look at parenting and upbringing, but you looked at the impact of media. And what did you find, generally speaking?
Yeah, generally speaking, I'm interested in the exact same thing, right? When we think about discriminatory beliefs of any sort, there's not going to be one, source of those beliefs that's coming from a lot of places. And so my area of research is looking at that and how it comes from the media. And so in this particular study, I was looking at local television news use. And if you look at local TV, there's a lot of crime and there's a lot of stereotypes about who is committing that crime. And so I found people who watched more local television news tend to have more bias against African Americans, at least at the unconscious level, which we were measuring.
And how did you measure that? Talk to us about sort of the logistics of the study.
Yeah, so the unconscious attitudes were measured using something called the implicit association test, or IAT, and you can Google that as the best way to learn all about it. You can take one online, and it measures unconscious attitudes, and it can be anything. So there are some related to race, of course. You can do it between presidential candidates, and you'll get sort of an unconscious who do you prefer. You can do it young versus old. It can be really set up for anything, and it's basically a reaction time sorting task where you're sorting images, in this case of either white or African American people, and you're sorting things related to attributes, good or bad. And so you'll find that when Caucasian or white is paired with good things, you're really fast at sorting the task. And when African American is paired with negative attributes, you're really fast at sorting the task. And so that gets it's a reaction time speed test, and that gets at these sort of unconscious attitudes because there's no real way to sort of fake this test.
And for comparison, you used also a population in Austria to have some sort of basis to compare the US to a population in another country and sort of draw some conclusions from that. Tell us a little bit about that part.
Yeah, so there's another researcher I was working with over in Europe who's done some background research looking at how foreigners are represented in certain media in Austria. And what he found was a very similar pattern to how African Americans are presented in the news media here, which is foreigners are overrepresented as criminals or as sort of scary or threatening in these Austria tabloids. And so what he found was, very similar to the results here in the US, is overrepresentation. The people who read a lot of those tabloids had this bias against foreigners. And so it's the exact same pattern, just with different social groups based on the different types of news media. And so because of that, we can say that in two different contexts, we're getting the same sort of pattern. And so, the implications certainly are that if you're being exposed to these stereotypes, it's going to influence your bias.
So let's talk a little bit about the US results. And you've talked about that correlation that exists where people in the US who watch more local television news seem to have more of these unconscious negative attitudes towards African Americans. Is there a possibility here that we're dealing with correlation but not causation, in the sense that there may be some third factor which would tell us why those who for some other reason harbor these negative beliefs or attitudes towards African Americans are also simply consuming more local news?
Yes, and that's certainly, a possibility. Anytime you're just basing things on survey data of any sort, right? You've got a correlation, but you can't say, with certainty that this news use is causing this particular bias. In this particular study, we had a lot of other variables, socioeconomic variables, lots of things thrown in there to help eliminate other possibilities. So if it was just, your socioeconomic background that was causing that, then it would have eliminated this effect. So this effect was still there, despite all these other things, which gives us a little more certainty, but we can never be absolutely certain, other than there have been people who have done experiments where you've done manipulated news content where different representations are shown in the news media, and that's shown to influence attitudes and then actually behaviors. And so paired with other experimental data, it helps us grow in confidence in that there is some sort of relationship here.
And how do you adjust in a study like this for the sort of reality that there are differing degrees, or there's a differing rate around the country, geographically speaking, to which we can attribute some of these attitudes towards minorities or African Americans as well? I mean, if we were to sort of plant the prevalence of certain
Right.
attitudes on a map, we would see that certain parts of the country already seem to have a higher level than others.
Right. Yeah, and that's certainly true. This was a very specific population. I'm in Houston, so this was a Houston-based sample. So again, when we're extrapolating to the population, we can't say, that is necessarily happening in Seattle or even, Montgomery, Alabama. We don't know that for certain. Other than we do have this other population in Austria, so we do know, or we can, draw some conclusions that anywhere there's an overrepresentation of any sort of stereotype, then this effect is probably going to happen.
And talk to us a little bit about the implications of knowing this. I mean, obviously, we've been talking about problems with the sort of half-hour local news format, which when you take out commercials, it becomes 22 minutes.
Right.
A third of that is typically weather, 2 or 3 weather segments. And then you have a lot of, half of what's left is usually content that's produced nationally. So if it's an ABC affiliate, they'll air 1 or 2 stories from ABC National. That leaves very little actual local news, and it's predominantly crime stories, as you've alluded to in the study. What are some of the broader implications of this?
Yes, well, when we're talking about, because we measured both unconscious and conscious attitudes in this study, but we're more focused on the unconscious attitudes, in part because people know when they fill out, any sort of survey and it's asking you about prejudice, we know at this point in time that we shouldn't necessarily be honest, even if we have those feelings. And so we're focused more on the unconscious attitudes. But the implications of finding this relationship with unconscious attitudes is really important, because the unconscious attitudes actually drive a lot of our behavior in an everyday setting. So something as simple as body language. We don't think about what body language we have when we're talking to somebody. That's very much driven by sort of an unconscious decision-making process. So if we have this unconscious bias, something as simple as our body language might change. And so we've seen there's other research that looks at things like body language of doctors can actually influence whether patients follow their orders. So there are a lot of ways that these unconscious attitudes can be important. And we even saw it last week, and obviously the details are still emerging exactly, but in the McKinney incident where the cop pulls out this gun, perhaps because he, thought his life was in danger. And so that's going to be, these sort of split-second decisions are driven by unconscious attitudes, because it's a very quick process that it's not a deliberative process where we're thinking about it. And so these unconscious attitudes are really important to study, because they can have some really, serious implications in the real world.
No question about that. I'll remind everybody we're talking about Professor Temple Northup's study, Effects of Long-Term Exposure to News Stereotypes on Implicit and Explicit Attitudes. He's an assistant professor at the University of Houston. Such interesting work. Thank you so much for talking to us about it.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.